organized mob. They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
His vitriolic attacks worked. He was re-elected by a huge majority, losing only 2 states to Alf Landon, the moderate governor of Kansas. On January 20th, 1937, Roosevelt told the nation that the work of his New Deal was far from over.
I see 1/3 of a nation still housed, still clad, still nourished.
But then Roosevelt's charmed presidency came unstuck. FDR's skill at reading the nation's political pulse abandoned him. He started his second term on a path that would lead to spectacular failure. The greatest political miscalculation of FDR's career grew out of a day 2 years before that New Dealers would remember as Black Monday. That was May 27, 1935, when the Supreme Court struck down the very heart of Roosevelt's New Deal by nullifying the National Recovery Act, insisting that the federal government had exceeded its constitutional authority.
A showdown with the court was inevitable. At no time in our history, before or since, has the court struck down so many pieces of vital legislation. The keystones to FDR's program in the first New Deal were the NRA and the Farm Program, the AAA. The Supreme Court destroyed both.
Now, flush with electoral triumph, FDR decided to take on the nation's justices.
The Democratic administration and the Congress made a gallant, sincere effort to raise wages, to reduce hours, to abolish child labor, and to eliminate unfair trade practices. And what happened? You know who assumed the power to veto and did veto that program. I say we must act now.
FDR's legislative remedy was to propose a bill that would add a jurist for every member of the court who had reached the age of 70. He claimed he only wanted to cut down their workload. It fooled no one. For months, he traveled the country, squandering the political capital won in the 1936 election. And with each passing day, the inevitability of defeat seemed apparent to everyone except Franklin Roosevelt.
He touched a nerve in public opinion and in the Congress that was quite raw. And the backlash against his proposal to change the number of justices on the Supreme Court was extreme.
Even some Democrats were critical. Representative John O'Connor insisted Roosevelt had to be stopped.
Reorganization bills aroused people of this country as they have seldom been stirred up before. They saw in that bill the threat of a dictatorship. That is why the House of Representatives defeated that bill. People of our country want no part of a dictator.
Final rejection came in July 1937, when the president failed to get the Senate to vote on the proposal. The court-packing episode was a stinging political reversal. A reversal compounded by the results of the 1938 midterm elections, which saw huge gains for the Republican Party. Together, they marked the end of congressional willingness to expand the reach of the New Deal.
It was a terrific blow to Roosevelt's ego and to his self-confidence. Well, then came the other side of Roosevelt that isn't so beautiful, and that is his vindictive streak. And in the 1938 elections, he personally campaigned in primaries against those who had opposed the Supreme Court. It was devastating. He got beaten every time. I think he only, if I recall correctly, he only won one election in the 10 or 12 people that he tried to defeat. It was incredibly humiliating.
Compounding the president's problems in 1938 was the emergence of a demand that he use his office to press for federal legislation outlawing the most extreme manifestation of racial bigotry.
I would argue that part of saving the nation is ending the crime of lynching. I don't think he has the moral choice of deciding that the fate of some of his citizens is less significant or less important or less urgent than the needs of the others.
His policy of benign neglect was now under assault. For years, he had been able to avoid confronting the reality of lynching. No longer. Eleanor Roosevelt would take the lead in demanding the Congress federalize the crime of lynching.
Your claims was our conception of how...
By 1938, Eleanor Roosevelt's campaign for racial justice was the culmination of an extraordinary personal journey. She had not come easily to the role of the administration's conscience. It is a story as remarkable as her husband's battle to overcome polio. At the beginning of FDR's presidency, Eleanor dreaded the prospect of moving into the White House.
Well, Eleanor Roosevelt very much did not want to be First Lady. The thought of living in the White House filled her with the greatest sense of possible dread.
Eleanor's fears grew out of a past marked by loneliness, insecurity, and betrayal. Orphaned at 8, she spent a lonely childhood living with her maternal grandmother, Mary Ludlow Hall, at Oak Terrace, the family estate in Tivoli, New York, alongside the Hudson. As a young girl, she had been told by her family that she was unattractive and had been given the nickname Granny.
As a whole, this family had great beauty. It was an unknown thing for a Hall girl not to be a belle at every party. One of the aunts was to say to me, "It is an extraordinary thing. You are the ugly duckling of the family."
She had Griselda moods, which I think were serious bouts with depression. And they didn't last long. She snapped out of it. But, you know, I think that was genuine and recurring bouts with depression.
But in her late teens, she turned the hurt into a passion for good deeds. In 1903, she volunteered at New York's Rivington Street Settlement House, helping East European refugees. She brought her distant cousin Franklin along to expose him to this alien world 100 miles from the security of Hyde Park.
I think she did it because she was overwhelmed with what she saw and wanted to share it with him. He was shocked. He had never been exposed to real poverty.
Over his mother's strong objections, she insisted they were too young, Franklin and Eleanor were married on March 17, 1905. Over the next 13 years, Eleanor stepped into the role of a traditional politician's wife as her husband moved up the political ladder. To help organize her social calendar, Eleanor hired a young woman named Lucy Page Mercer. The family soon included her in the Washington party circuit that Eleanor despised and her husband relished. Lucy was everything Eleanor was not, and Franklin was entranced.
What drew Lucy to Roosevelt was that she had enormous self-confidence, she had a charm, she was flirtatious, she was statuesque, she was beautiful, but she was warm, and she could respond to his playfulness in a way that at that point Eleanor, who had much less confidence in herself, could not.
I think FDR was bowled over by falling in love, and perhaps for the first time in his life, really head over heels in love.
Eleanor had her suspicions, but was assuaged by her husband's denials. The moment of truth came in the summer of 1918. FDR seemed distracted, anxious to have her go to their summer home in Campobello without him. When she opened his suitcase after an overseas trip, she discovered why. Inside, she found letters, evidence of her worst fear, that her husband was indeed having an affair with Lucy.
It confirmed the darkest fears she had about herself, that she could never hold on to anyone as handsome and dashing as her husband, and that it was a sort of confirmation of all the betrayals of her girlhood that she's really expected from life.
More in resignation than anger, Eleanor offered Franklin a divorce. Her mother-in-law, Sarah, horrified by the potential scandal, insisted that was out of the question. If her son left Eleanor and the children, Sarah would cut him out of the estate.
So it was then that they came to a discussion with one another that he promised he would never see Lucy again, and she therefore would stay with him in marriage.
Eleanor Roosevelt would stay in the marriage, but on her own terms. She would now set her own goals and find her own voice. By the time FDR was elected president in 1932, Eleanor was seen as the more progressive of the two.
She was on the board of the Women's Trade Union.